The film begins in space, with the starship Avalon flying autonomously to the colony world of Homestead 2 as the population of Earth evacuates. All 5,000 passengers and personnel will sleep for 120 years. We have been on the road for 30 years now. When the ship is in the midst of a meteor storm, the power is temporarily cut off as it is rerouted to the forward shields. However, after crashing into a particularly huge meteor, the power is briefly restored and red alert screens are activated in the control room. It seems like a dreadful event has occurred. When mechanical engineer Jim Preston, Chris Pratt, awakes in his pod, he is greeted by a kind computer voice informing him that they will soon be arriving at Homestead 2. As a result of his hibernation, he is experiencing some common symptoms, including confusion and weakness. His armband is scanned, and he is shown the way to his sleeping quarters on the ship. The following day, he gets up, attempts to pick out an outfit for when he meets the other travelers, and eventually finds his way to a cafeteria where he is the only customer. He attends a colonist orientation session, but he is the only one present. His question concerning why there is no one else there is lost on the cheerful computer-generated teacher. Jim tries to seek information at the main concourse information kiosk but is met with silence. To send a message to the Homestead Company, he visits a business where he is advised that the cost will be high. He realizes that it will be 15 years before anyone on Earth receives his message in which he pleads for assistance because he is the only one awake. Right now, he's out on his own. Jim locates user guides for all ship systems. After reading the hibernation pod's handbook, he still can't figure out how to restart it after the user awakens. Neither the crew pods nor the command center are accessible to him, so he cannot ask for assistance there. The clearance on his bracelet is invalid. Jim meets Arthur, the robot bartender, played by Michael Sheen. Jim is able to converse with Arthur, but the robot can only give Jim bartending advice, such as if you don't like where you are, change things. Jim is a traveler in the economy class, therefore his cabin has minimal amenities, but he manages to sneak into the first-class suite. Jim spends a year making use of the ship's amenities while desperately trying to avoid his growing sense of isolation. He makes his way to the spacesuit fitting room, where people can step outdoors while still being securely attached to the spacecraft. Without a spacesuit, Jim was about to commit himself by opening the airlock, but he had a change of heart and ran into the pod area instead. He falls near a pod containing a beautiful woman named Aurora, Jennifer Lawrence. He looks over the passenger profile she filled out before the ship left port. She's a reporter curious about the allure of colonialism and hoping to get some great stories out of her trip to Homestead. When he reads her novels, he can't help but think that she's wonderful. He debates whether or not to wake her up, knowing that doing so will guarantee her death aboard the ship, but after a year alone, he finally gives in and manually triggers her pod to wake her up, ducking out of sight before she notices him. Aurora is woken up and directed to her sleeping quarters by the same upbeat computer software every day. The following day, Aurora finds herself all by herself. She decides to explore the main concourse and ends up meeting Jim there. He is honest with her about how long he has been awake, but he doesn't let on that he was the one who roused her. The robot bartender Arthur has been asked and agreed upon not to inform Aurora of his actions. Aurora and Jim have been communicating often, thinking about different ways to repair the pods. Aurora does some swimming, some running, and some writing. Jim explains that he left Earth because he enjoys making and repairing things, but that such activities are frowned upon and often discouraged on the planet. He plans to build his own home and move into it. Her intention was to visit the colony, spend a year there learning from colonists about their experiences, and then return to Earth to share what she had learned. Aurora is a gold-class traveler, and she utilizes her privileges to get him fancier breakfast than his normal security clearance allows. Aurora and Jim had been talking for a while before Jim asked her out on a date, and she said yes. They dress in the 2 available spacesuits and head outside after finishing their meal. Aurora is ecstatic as they return, so they proceed to Jim's cabin for some passionate making out. They are content with their lives on board, which consist of regular exercise, stargazing, and making use of the ship's amenities. After another year together, Aurora's birthday rolls around, and Jim has a special surprise in store. He crafted a ring for her. Aurora tells Arthur outside the bar that she and Jim don't keep any secrets from each other, and Jim agrees, but he doesn't realize that Aurora has already heard that Jim woke her up. As Jim enters the locker room, Arthur congratulates Aurora on being Jim's first wake-up call of the day. Aurora is heartbroken and enraged, and she begs Jim to leave her alone. She sneaks into his cabin while he's sleeping and punches him repeatedly. While Aurora is fleeing away, Jim tries to explain himself over the ship's intercom, but she yells that he killed her. Meanwhile, the frequency with which warnings of system problems are being sent to the control room has been steadily increasing. Jim and Aurora have picked up on subtle issues, such as the cleaning robots experiencing technical difficulties. A whole 2 years have passed since the meteor impact. As a deck crew chief, Gus, Lawrence Fishburne, had to get up early in order to make it to work on time. One day, he emerges on the concourse. He explains that something extremely serious is wrong because hibernation pods have never failed before. After entering the control room with the help of his wristband, they learn that the ship's automatic diagnostics have failed and that they would have to physically inspect each deck. Aurora almost drowns in the pool when the gravity suddenly fails while Gus is doing testing to ensure this is possible. When Gus investigates, he discovers evidence of a chain reaction of failures. Using the computer, he is able to construct a timeline that reveals the first incident occurred 2 years ago. Gus figures out that power diversions were made after the initial failures in an attempt to re-equalize the load, but that the load eventually grew too much and led to more problems. There is a risk that the entire ship will die in space, killing everyone on board. The initial outbreak started in the main engine compartment, but pinpointing the exact location will need a detailed investigation. Gus falls at this moment, and Jim and Aurora take him to the medical center to be examined by a medical auto-diagnostic scanner. Because of the defective hibernation pod, numerous necrosis have spread throughout his body, and he will likely die soon. He dresses in his uniform and gets ready to die, then hands his wristband to Jim and Aurora so they can get to the parts of the ship they need to reach to make repairs. Jim and Aurora, both engineers, discover a meteorite crater that cuts through vital components. After opening one of the doors, Aurora is almost sucked out through a hole in the hull. Jim pushes a tablet at her to use as a plug, and he also applies liquid sealant to cover the hole. There is an increase in pressure, and they find out that the fusion engine exhaust needs to be released by hand. Because the manual override isn't working, Jim has to put on a spacesuit and walk outside to make the necessary adjustments. To get the manual vent to work, he has to enter the exhaust channel and open a flap, but it keeps closing unless Jim holds it open. Aurora is now so afraid of losing Jim that she fights with him over the radio before pulling the trigger. Jim is ejected after being pushed out, his tether snaps and his suit is damaged. He bids farewell to Aurora. She quickly grabs a spacesuit and launches off to find him. Jim's rope gets yanked and she brings him back inside, but he's unconcerned the whole time. They take him by force to the hospital, where the auto doctor pronounces Jim dead. Aurora enters Gus's override code and uses his wristband to successfully revive Jim. The news that he is still alive has brought her immense joy and relief. Later, life aboard the ship returns to normal. Jim fixes the autodock and explains to Aurora that he could put her in hibernation again in the infirmary by using the command override. But then he would be all by himself. Aurora decides to join Jim in his constant vigil and to start a new life with him on the ship. After 88 years. Finally, the captain and crew awake at the ship's grand concourse, where they discover a massive tree, a plethora of trailing vines and plants, flying birds, and a cabin, perhaps containing Jim and Aurora's grandchildren. Aurora's narrator is reading aloud to the passengers from her memoir, detailing the family's successful adaptation to their new environment.